Thank you very much, Ajwa, and thank you, moderator, the CEOs in the room, the leaders in the private sector, Your Excellency, the High Commissioner representing the President of Sierra Leone, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you this morning. I came from Dar es Salaam via Nairobi. I was determined to be here with you for the session today, and I want to congratulate you, Ajwa, and the team that supports you for all the hard work that you do to bring a positive impact on investor confidence in relation to our continent. You started this journey, as you said, 3 years ago, and all of us know the difficult times that we have been through in the last 2 years, and so congratulations to you and the team for your persistence and the hard work. So this morning, the theme that I have been asked to speak on relates to the investment outlook for Africa, and if I may extend it to ask the question how, and I hope in the course of my presentation to ask the question, to answer this question, and that is, how does the AfCFTA facilitate investment into Africa, either from African corporations or businesses or foreign direct investment into Africa? As you may be aware, the African Continental Free Trade Area now has 43 countries that are state parties. In other words, 43 countries that have accepted the legal obligations to reduce barriers to investment in Africa, to reduce barriers to trade in Africa, and of course to ensure that Africa becomes globally competitive in the way in which other parts and other countries that are similarly situated are globally competitive today. Africa is mainly a supplier of raw materials and accounts for 1/3 of all resources, all resource-dependent countries. African countries rich in raw materials generate revenue through exports of these raw materials, but sadly, as we all know, we are overly, as a continent, we are overly reliant on the export of unprocessed raw commodities. This over-reliance on the export of unprocessed raw commodities, in my view, contributes to what I refer to as a colonial economic model, a persistent colonial economic model where Africa continues to supply raw commodities largely to countries of the North. One of the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area, in fact, the main objective of the African Continental Free Trade Area, is to reverse this trend, to place the African continent on a trajectory for value-added production and total transformation of Africa's economy, a fundamental restructuring of Africa's economy to ensure global competitiveness in decades to come. The African market, again, as you may be aware, has a lot of potential. 1.3 billion people, with a combined GDP today, as we speak, of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. And in 2019, of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world at that time, 6 were on the African continent, with an average growth rate of about 3.5% per annum. About 30% of all global mineral reserves are found on the African continent. The continent's proven oil reserves constitute 8% of the world's stock, and those of natural gas amount to 7%. Minerals account for an average of 70% of total African exports and about 28% of gross domestic product. A practical example that gives real-life meaning to these statistics. If you think about the fact that over 70% of global cobalt comes from one country on the African continent. And as the world transitions from combustible engines to electric vehicles, those in Africa, those countries in Africa who are well endowed with the natural resources that are required to make electric vehicles viable and to make the industry of electric vehicles viable in future, these countries stand to benefit. The processing and transformation of oxide into lithium batteries, oxide which we know is found in the DRC. When you think about the contribution of Africa to the iPhone global supply chain, the potential that Africa has where we invest as a continent, where we invest in the processing of our raw materials into finished products and export them not only intra-Africa but to the rest of the world. This approach is what will ensure that Africa is released from these shackles of the colonial economic model, which, as I mentioned earlier, us as Africans, of course, we have to take responsibility for the fact that we sustained this colonial economic model probably for the last 65 to 70 years. And so we now have a responsibility to reverse this trend. Another example which I wish to cite is the coffee industry. $6 billion in 2015 that we exported of raw coffee, $6 billion of unprocessed coffee to the rest of the world. The coffee is processed in the rest of the world, contributes to a $100 billion industry. And so you can see the losses for Africa along the value chain in the auto sector that I mentioned, in the coffee industry that I have also just mentioned. The AfCFTA therefore intends to position Africa for transformation of our natural resources, value-added production, leveraging on this market of $1.3 billion. It will, of course, take significant investment for the African continent to see the benefits of industrialization. We have now mobilized some moderate investment in the area of the automotive sector. We have mobilized through a partnership with AfrEximbank $1 billion to ensure that countries who want to be part of the automotive sector value chain and job creation in this sector, that they have the resources that are required to do so. The automotive sector, as you know, has a lot of potential for any country's industrialization. We know this from the experience of Germany, particularly immediately after the Second World War, and how the automotive sector transformed the economy of Germany and, of course, other countries that are adjacent to Germany. And therefore, the automotive sector has potential equally for the African continent to transform, create jobs, and industrialize our continent. Today, Africa produces close to 1 million vehicles a year between South Africa and Morocco. A similarly populated country, India, produces 5 million units of vehicles per year, imports only essential components, and of course creates millions and millions of jobs in the auto industry and is able to be globally competitive. The African continent, similarly situated in population, produces, as I've just said, only close to 1 million vehicles per year. That deficit in the difference in numbers between India's productive capacity in the automotive sector and Africa's deficit in terms of productive capacity is an opportunity for us to accelerate our industrialization, create jobs, spur on innovation, and position our continent for global competitiveness. And so this $1 billion will ensure that we develop a value chain in Africa for the automotive sector, We processed rubber in Liberia. We process copper in Zambia. We process oxide in the DRC. We process leather for leather seats for the automotive sector in Ethiopia, until all of us are equally participants in the automotive sector through this value chain and this investment of close to $1 billion by Afreximbank. The other example that is equally worrisome and demonstrates the need for Africa to accelerate investment in this natural resource is the fact that in the year 2019, we as a continent imported $16 billion worth of pharmaceutical products. $16 billion worth of jobs that are exported, $16 billion worth of innovation that is exported, and of course, the lack of competitiveness that comes with an over-reliance on the export and on the import, rather, of pharmaceutical products. Not only does this cause the affordability of public health in Africa to be out of reach for millions and millions of Africans, but more importantly, of course, it maintains the colonial economic model that I just referred to, which we as Africans have to extricate ourselves from and ensure that we process our minerals in Africa. The pharmaceuticals products, this $16 billion worth of imports, most of these products, as we all know, rely on agricultural inputs from the African continent. And so the AfCFTA, through the Protocol on Intellectual Property Rights, again intends to position the continent to reverse this trend. We intend to have an intellectual property rights regime that will ensure that we establish a generic drug industry in Africa, that we establish productive capacity for pharmaceutical products in Africa for the purpose of protecting public health of Africans, but also to ensure that we contribute to Africa's industrialization. We have already seen these trends, these very positive trends. We have seen the emergence of a pharmaceuticals industry in Senegal, in the Gambia, in South Africa, and recently where we launched last week the establishment of a vaccine manufacturing plant in Rwanda. All of these efforts are critical to ensuring that Africa industrializes and that Africa takes responsibility, and correctly so, takes responsibility for the need to process our minerals. The other sector of critical importance, as I've mentioned earlier, is agriculture. We know that the linkages of the agricultural sector, we know of the linkages to the pharmaceuticals industry, to the automotive industry, over 30,000 components in a vehicle. Most of these components are based on the agricultural sector. And so it is incumbent upon us as we implement the AfCFTA to establish regional value chains on agriculture that will enable us to lift millions and millions of farmers out of subsistence farming into the formal economy of agriculture, to ensure food security, and second, to ensure that the AfCFTA does contribute to value addition and does contribute to the agro-processing industry and transformation of people's lives from subsistence farming onto part of the formal trade economy of Africa. When I mention this potential for the agricultural sector as one of the drivers of industrialization in Africa, some people think that I am dreaming. But actually, if you think about it, look at what China has been able to do in less than one generation, lifting millions and millions of farmers out of poverty through agro-processing and through establishing regional value chains that are inclusive for farmers, both big farmers and agro-processing, and the result, of course, all of us, as we know, millions and millions of people lifted out of poverty in less than one generation. And so it is possible also in Africa for us to see these results of inclusivity, of a trade agreement, and inclusivity in industrialization. We implement this agreement, the AfCFTA, recognizing that if we benefit only the large corporations in Africa, and some of them are here, my very good friends from the large corporations, fully conscious that if we benefit only the large corporations, we are not going to see the results that all of us want to see. We're not going to see 100 million Africans by the year 2035 being lifted out of poverty. We're not going to double intra-Africa trade by the year 2035 if we don't work towards inclusivity of benefits. We know from the experience of other countries around the world, we know what happened in parts of Europe when benefits of trade agreements were seen to be accruing only to large corporations. This led to rejection of globalization. This led to rejection of trade agreements as an instrument for societal development. And the result is that we had right-wing fascist fundamentalist regimes in some parts of Western Europe, and certainly led in part to the emergence of Donald Trump, because he said, come with me, trade agreements don't work, they export jobs to Mexico, come with me. And those right-wing fundamentalist fascist regimes in Western Europe that said, we offer an alternative to globalization, we offer something different to globalization, to trade agreements. That is why it is absolutely critical that as we implement this agreement, we are at the fore of our minds, very, very conscious of the impact of a trade agreement that does not lead to inclusive benefits. We have a responsibility to reverse this backlash, to reverse this trend, to make sure and to demonstrate, not only to the rest of the world, but to ourselves, that trade agreements can lead to prosperity for all, that trade agreements can contribute to a region or a country's industrialization, provided you have the tools that are required for inclusivity. I will take a moment to talk about some of these tools. First, small, medium enterprises, young entrepreneurs. We have placed as a priority young entrepreneurs, small, medium enterprises that are led by women, as a priority segment of society in the benefits and in the implementation of this agreement. The AfCFTA will be the first of its kind, the very first trade agreement in the world to have a protocol on women and youth in trade. For the very first time in the world, we as Africans are translating, we are codifying our aspirations for young people in trade, aspirations for small, medium enterprises. We're codifying this into legally binding obligations for governments that have accepted the legal obligations of the treaty to ensure that they implement this protocol in a way that provides benefits for all and in a way that sets the trade agreement as an instrument for inclusivity. The protocol on women and youth in trade is under negotiation, and we believe that by the end of the year, we will conclude the protocol, and as I emphasize, the first of its kind in the world in the area of trade. The second important tool, again for inclusivity, is the protocol, is the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. You will hear from some of our bankers here today. Some of the largest banks on the African continent are now have switched onto the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System. We, in 1 year, in a single year, Africa, in terms of transactions, dollar transactions, foreign currency transactions, that amount to $18.5 billion that we use the SWIFT system for transactions within Africa. $18.5 billion in the year 2019 is how much Africa spent on transactions using the SWIFT system. If you want to trade between Ghana and Kenya, you have to first convert the Ghanaian cedi into a third currency. Your counterparty in Kenya receives this third currency. They then have to convert the third currency into their local currency, the Kenyan shilling. Our estimate is that this costs Africa's economy $5 billion a year. That's what we can quantify. What we cannot quantify is the cost to Africa's competitiveness, the cost to efficiency, the cost in terms of lack of access to trade for small, medium enterprises, and lack of access to trade for young entrepreneurs. And so this is a result of the fact that we have 42 currencies in Africa. And so the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System is intended to overcome this challenge, to make sure that you can trade in your local currency on a digital platform in real time without going through the route of a correspondent bank in another part of the world, or indeed without having to wait 2 weeks before your counterparty receives or the amount is credited to their account. This, we believe, this Pan-African Payments and Settlement System is a tool that will ensure inclusivity, that will ensure that will enable us to boost intra-Africa trade by the year 2035, hopefully to double it by that year. The third tool, which is also critical in terms of implementation of the AfCFTA, are the trade corridors. As you know, the African continent, each region has its own trade corridor, but these trade corridors are fragmented, and they require investment, and they require investment in terms of infrastructure, hard infrastructure, and soft infrastructure. And with the support of the British government, we have now started a work program to ensure efficiency of our trade corridors, to ensure competitiveness of our trade corridors, so that we boost intra-Africa trade and double intra-Africa trade by the year 2035. If goods are not transiting between East Africa and Southern Africa, or Central Africa and West Africa, we shall not see the benefits of this trade agreement. That is why we have to take an integrated approach in improving the efficiency of our trade corridors. The last tool, which is also important, is trade finance. Trade finance is estimated to be a deficit of $150 billion in Africa. It is inaccessible for many, many small, medium enterprises. And so we are working very hard with our partners, development finance institutions on the continent, to ensure that we have a trade finance facility that is developed to benefit small, medium enterprises, particularly small, medium enterprises that are led by women and young people, so that they too see the benefits of this trade agreement. And I hope that by the end of this year, we will be able to make an announcement about the availability of a trade finance facility that will be linked to implementation of the AfCFTA. Let me close by citing a projection by the World Bank. A projection, and of course I don't always agree with the World Bank, but this is a very encouraging projection and a surprising projection by the World Bank, and that is that where we implement the AfCFTA and where we implement it effectively, whatever that means, by the year 2035, we will have the opportunity to lift 100 million Africans out of poverty, 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty, 70 million Africans out of moderate poverty, contribute to Africa's GDP, $450 billion, increase intra-Africa trade by 80%, and more importantly, the beneficiaries of all of these positive projections, the World Bank says the beneficiaries will be small medium enterprises that are led by women. This is the kind of inclusivity in trade agreements that I want to see, and I believe all of us want to see, so that as we invest in industrialization, as we invest in the processing of copper, as we invest in the processing of oxide into lithium batteries, and as we invest in productive capacity in the pharmaceutical sector, manufacturing of agricultural products into pharmaceuticals, that all Africans see the benefits of this trade agreement. If we do not succeed to do that, if we do not succeed to have inclusive industrialization, inclusive benefits, I'm afraid we're going to see the results of a trade agreement in Africa being rejected in the same way that in other parts of the world, trade agreements were rejected and were said to be benefiting only the elite. And so investment, not only investment in the natural resources sector, which is important, investment also in small medium enterprises and in young entrepreneurs to drive economic growth in Africa is critical. We will conclude by the end of this year the protocol on investment protection and investment facilitation, which will not be intended for a specific sector, but will actually be intended to provide legal protections, general legal protections, both to African and non-African investors, and to do so in a way that balances the rights of investors as well as the rights of communities, whether we are talking about in the services sector or in manufacturing, extractive industries. We intend to make sure that this protocol on investment, once again, as I mentioned earlier, reverses the trends of the past, particularly to lack of sustainable investment that we witnessed over the last 65 to 70 years. And so, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this is an ambitious task, the implementation of the AfCFTA. It is an ambitious task to transform Africa's economy, and I know that it is not going to happen overnight. As I've said before, industrialization is not a pill that you swallow and you wake up the next day, you've industrialized. It is going to take disciplined, decade after decade effort of implementation of this agreement to ensure that the African continent becomes as prosperous and as globally competitive as any other part of the world in 20, 30 to 40 years' time from now. And so I end where I started. And where I started, I said, we are talking about investment. But in our view, investment in the frame of the AfCFTA is not only about investing in minerals, not only about investing in the extractive sector, which are very important. It is also investing in an inclusive trade agreement that creates opportunities for small medium enterprises, for young Africans, so that young Africans stop dying and being buried deep in the oceans of the Mediterranean as they try to come to Europe to look for better opportunities. That's the kind of investment that we want to see. That's the kind of a future that I believe the AfCFTA is intended to create for decades to come for young Africans. I want to thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you very much for the attention. Thank you.